I'm going to spend the next half hour or so asking you to take a time journey with me, and to share with you some thoughts about why, in many ways, this is such a special time. Let's start in the future, maybe 10 years from now, maybe 20 years from now, maybe 30 years from now. And imagine that when we go for our checkups, or maybe even something that we can do at home, we can get a blood test. And from a single blood test, not only find out whether our potassium is normal and our cholesterol is normal, but whether we may be in the very earliest stages of a path to cancer, or whether our children may be at the very earliest stages of a path to diabetes, or a family member may be destined to get Alzheimer's disease or Lewy body disease, as Susan was just discussing. And imagine not only could we find that out, but that we could do something about it. Maybe the form that would take would be a vaccine, or a pill, or a genetic medicine, or a cell-based medicine, or maybe it would just be a set of lifestyle changes, for example, based on a much deeper understanding than we have today of how what we eat affects our health. And by the way, maybe those foods would have been grown with no chemicals, and would have consumed a sustainable amount of water when they were grown, and would have been optimized very specifically for the land on which they were grown, using vast amounts of data processed with the benefits of artificial intelligence. I think that we would agree that such a future would be compelling, and that its impact would be undeniable. The world would be unrecognizable in many ways, and along the way there would be trillions of dollars of value created. That's a world that I think is worth trying to create. Now, let's go back a little bit into the past, to the year 1986. That was the year that I graduated medical school. And try to put yourself in the position of a patient, or a family, or a physician in 1986. If somebody just got the diagnosis of rheumatoid arthritis, or multiple sclerosis, or a variety of cancers such as chronic myelogenous leukemia, or breast cancer, or had developed hepatitis of unknown cause at the time, or you had a child with spinal muscular atrophy. Now, there was a pandemic going on in 1986. It was the AIDS pandemic. And imagine if you got a diagnosis of AIDS at that time. And of course, nobody at that time knew anything about something called SARS-CoV-2 or COVID. Now, flash forward a decade or 2 decades later, the intervening time between 1986 and now, the story changed dramatically for patients and families and physicians confronting these problems. By the 90s, therapies had been developed for HIV, which were so dramatically effective that the mortality quickly went from 100% and decreased by 90%. In fact, in 1986, I was working at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, and there was an AIDS ward. In 1996, that ward was closed. There was no need for it anymore. Likewise, there were very effective treatments that were becoming available as the millennium came to a close, for multiple sclerosis and rheumatoid arthritis and the cancers that I mentioned. I referred to a form of hepatitis. In 1986, we knew some people had hepatitis that wasn't hepatitis A, not hepatitis B, but we didn't know what it was. We called it non-A, non-B. In the intervening time, not only did we understand that it was a different form called hepatitis C, we fully characterized that form, and now there's curative therapies available for hepatitis C. And more recently for spinal muscular atrophy, some fantastic treatments have been developed, which are giving hope to families that had no hope in the past. And then, of course, that brings us to the present day and SARS-CoV-2 and COVID. Of course, now everybody's heard of that. Sadly, the official numbers are that 5 million people in the world have died. The estimates by a number of people are that it's probably 15 million based on unexplained excess deaths in the world. And many, many more millions are struggling from either the loss of a loved one, or from long COVID, or from the mental health toll that the pandemic is having. But as bad as that is, and Susan referred to this a few minutes ago, there's a source of hope. As you know, there's unprecedented speed in characterizing the SARS-CoV-2 virus and discovering and developing vaccines. And I'll come back to that in a few minutes. But one of the questions that's on many people's minds is, was the speed with which we were able to step up for COVID an aberration? Or is it an indication of the future? And the message that I'd like to convey today is that I emphatically believe it's an indication of the future, and there's great source of hope, and there's better things to come. So what's going on, and why do I believe that? Well, I believe that we're at the dawn of the biological century. And what I mean by that is we're entering an era where it is now possible for the first time to understand aspects of biology that explain the mechanisms of disease. And it's also becoming possible to do something about it in many instances where we didn't previously have anything to do. And so what's happened with COVID is a logical extension of the other progress that I've described to you. It's not an aberration at all. The foundation for the biological century is largely advances in technologies that we can bring to bear on biology. Many of these technologies relate to genes, genetic analysis, gene sequencing, single cell analysis of differences in genes and gene expression, improvements in imaging such as MRI and other high resolution techniques, the ability to synthesize genes, edit genes, regulate genes, and increasingly the ability, as I referred to at the beginning, to process vast amounts of biological and other complex information using tools such as AI and ML. Along the way, what we're starting to see are entirely new categories of therapeutics. In the 80s, therapeutics were, for the most part, either small molecule drugs or certain proteins, largely purified proteins that were purified very laboriously. But now we have ready access to recombinant DNA technology to create recombinant proteins. We've seen the success of antisense drugs. We're seeing some of the potential of gene therapies. We're increasingly able to harness cells as therapeutics. There have been now successful phase 3 trials actually using the microbiome as a therapeutic. And of course, recently, great advances in using various forms of mRNA as therapeutics. So this combination of new technologies and the kinds of therapeutic modalities that they enable is a source of real power to solve many of the problems that we all worry about in our families. And what's going on is it's created this virtuous cycle where advances in technology lead to advances in understanding, and then advances in understanding inform further advances in technology, and so on. And so we now have this flywheel where we're getting better and better at understanding health and disease and doing something about it. So, what are some of the implications of the biological century? At a high level, what's happening in front of our eyes is that we're going from a time when understanding biology and making drugs was all about discovery and trial and error, to a time when it's going to be all about designing solutions. So it's going to go more from a discovery paradigm to an engineering paradigm. And the discovery itself is becoming highly parallelized and less exclusively dependent on tailored hypotheses. Let me give you one example of this. As you know, CRISPR-Cas9 and now other gene editing systems have really revolutionized our ability to interrogate biology. And so, for example, with CRISPR-Cas9, it's now possible to put 100,000 different edits of T cells into an intact animal and observe the effects of all of these edits, and then quickly figure out which of them are having the most significant effect on a T cell that one might be interested in. In the past, that was simply not possible. And the ability to do these kinds of highly parallel interrogations in intact systems is part of a real revolution. A second implication is that many of the modalities that I've mentioned are really programmable modalities. In the past, the design of a small molecule was a real artisanal process that was generally the purview of a single medicinal chemist applying his insights or her insights and experience with a lot of trial and error. But now technologies such as chemically modified RNA or siRNA or some of the genetic technologies make it possible, because they're based on a code, to, once you know how to manipulate the code, quickly to generate many, many different possibilities, and then use various technologies very, very quickly to figure out which is the best one. By the way, that's not confined only to genetic technologies. So a very interesting advance that's beginning to emerge is the use of degrader technology in chemistry. But the idea there is the same, is that you're using a template, you're using a code, and then you're directing a particular functionality to wherever you want to direct it. And that's already showing a lot of promise. Other implications. Up until now, the world of drug discovery has largely been one of probability, and in fact, very low probability. We're starting to move into an era where it's going to become much more predictable. It has been very slow, typically taking 10 years or more to create a new drug. I've already given you a couple of examples of where that's been accelerated orders of magnitude. And I think that we're going to see more and more acceleration as well. There's been this trend going on for decades now that it's just gotten more and more expensive. And it's now estimated that the all-in cost of developing a drug is typically around $2 billion or more. I predict that in the biological century, this trend is going to reverse, and it's not only going to become more predictable and faster, but it's going to become cheaper. And then the real ultimate is implications for the very paradigm by which we think of our health and of getting sick. For the most part, with some notable exceptions, in particular vaccines, but for the most part, the entire approach to disease now is to treat it. And often the disease is fairly progressed before you even know you have it. And so therefore, the treatments, while they may have some benefit, are of limited benefit. But what we are increasingly having the ability to contemplate is actually preventing disease. And preventing disease, by and large, is going to have much more profound benefits for society than treating disease. So what I'm really saying is that we're going from an era of guessing to an era of knowing. At this point in history, the inception of the biological century, we're really at the beginning of an S curve of biological understanding and productivity. So just as people in Silicon Valley talked about Moore's Law, I think we're seeing the equivalent of a Moore's Law effect in biology and in the development of therapeutics. And that's going to become increasingly productive as time passes. The message at its core is that the biological century is upon us. And I think that this is a unique opportunity for anyone in the biological sciences, and that it's great fortune to be in this area of endeavor at this moment in history. So in order to realize the full potential of the biological century, one can ask the question, well, what if something were possible? One of the reasons why I started by asking you to imagine with me a future 10 or 20 or 30 years from now is to help you to understand the power of that approach. If we imagine a future that we want, and then we reason back work back from that, that's a way of conceiving of innovations that can be completely disruptive. I would suggest that if in 1986 you sat down with a physician or a scientist and you gave them the list of diseases that I started with and said, what if in 10 to 15 or so years, we'll have either very effective treatments for all of these diseases or even cures for some of them? I think a lot of people would have said, well, that's nice, but it's not really going to be possible. And therefore, we shouldn't really spend time talking about it. But in fact, that's exactly what happened. And so I think that it's incumbent upon us to imagine an even better future 10 or 20 years from now than we have today. And the way to approach this is to ask, if something were possible, would it be valuable? Rather than what's often asked, which is, what is the value of something that's probable? I think that we should be seeking to create new precedents and not fear going into areas where everything has failed to date, and not fear to aspire to do something unprecedented. Now, a lot of this happens in companies, and when I think about companies, there's a set of ways I think that one can kind of get a sense of how ambitious is this company, how aspirational is this company. So, for example, one can ask, is what this company is doing likely to help a few people, or could it help millions and millions of people? When you talk to the people in a company, you can get a sense, are they building this company to be the company of the next few years? Or are they building it to be a great company for the next few decades, or maybe even the next century? Is the company really setting out to take a piece of an existing market segment, or is the company seeking to create entirely new markets? And of course, there's always the financial metric as well, which is, I think, generally in biotech, not the point for most people, but it's just a way of measuring impact. And one can ask, is the company setting out to create millions of dollars of value, or billions of dollars of value, or hundreds of billions of dollars of value, or even more? So I thought that it would be good to give two illustrations of this to remind us of how this can play out and how exciting it can be. So one of them is just a brief few comments on Moderna. So our firm, Flagship Pioneering, started Moderna in 2010. And it had actually been, since the 80s, for many people, a topic of interest to ask the question, well, could you just take RNA and somehow just use the RNA to get cells to make a protein? But approaches to try to do this inevitably failed because RNA typically triggers the innate immune response, and the cells can't do anything for any sustained period of time. In the first decade of the new millennium, there were a couple of reports, including one in 2010, that maybe certain modifications of RNA could actually evade the innate immune response. And one such report was really focused on solving the problem of cellular reprogramming, which had been the basis just a few years previously for the Nobel Prize. And it was known, the work that gave rise to the Nobel Prize from Yamanaka's lab, that 4 factors could reprogram pluripotent stem cells. But it was a very, very inefficient process. And so it was shown that using chemically modified RNA in an in vitro system, that it might be possible to make that more efficient. The state of play at that moment was, it looked like this might be possible. Nothing had been shown in animals. Nothing had been shown at scale. It wasn't clear how much protein cells would make. It wasn't clear which cells would make it. It wasn't clear generally whether protein that was made by cells in this manner would be folded correctly and secreted and appropriately functional. And it certainly wasn't shown how one might formulate these things to make them into useful therapeutics. And so my colleagues and I at Flagship asked the question, well, what if it were possible to do all of those things? Would that be a valuable future? And we became convinced that if only we could demonstrate this once or a few times, that we would have enormous impact. And this is a really important point, that we felt that we would have impact without really knowing how. Certainly we didn't anticipate a pandemic emerging 10 years later. But we felt that this capability could not but have impact. So we did a series of experiments in 2010 and 2011 in our laboratories. And the results of those experiments answered many of the questions that I just posed a moment ago. And that gave us the confidence that not only would the future be valuable and impactful, but that it might be possible. And we created Moderna to realize the full potential of that possibility. Now, over the subsequent 10 years, the company was built. A critical thing, of course, is that we hired a team that truly truly is fantastic. Stefan Bancel, the CEO, was actually the first person that we hired. And the team that has built around Stefan is clearly world-class. Moderna then industrialized this platform, scaled it, very importantly, proactively developed a robust manufacturing approach. And what's not always fully appreciated is that over the last few years, it started testing multiple different vaccines in the clinic. So in late December, early January of 2019, 2020, there began to be rumors and reports about something going on in Wuhan. And over January, although it was not clear at that time that this was going to become the pandemic that it has, it did become clear that there was a new kind of virus, that it was not flu or some variant of flu. It wasn't SARS or MERS, et cetera. And Moderna decided that they should focus some of their attention on this virus, largely at that time, because they thought that if nothing else, it would be a great way to demonstrate how quickly their approach could yield a vaccine. When the sequence was reported, Moderna took that information and in 2 days had generated a prototype RNA vaccine against the S protein of the virus. The previous fastest that this had been done was 5 years. And in March of 2020, they started the clinical trials. By May of 2020, they had the initial results from those trials showing a robust neutralizing antibody response to the vaccine. And by November, they had phase 3 data showing a 94% protective effect. Along the way, and this is one of the less heralded but more heroic aspects of what was happening, they scaled manufacturing from what had previously been done at a scale of a few thousand doses to a scale of roughly 1 billion doses. And I'll never forget in the beginning of December when the data came in. My partner Nubar, who's the chairman of the board, called me on a Saturday and he said, "We just got the data." And it was one of the most exciting moments that I've ever had in my entire career. So now we're well into the era of vaccination. Moderna will produce, it's forecasting 700 to 800 million doses of vaccine this year, and many millions of people from what Moderna and also, of course, Pfizer are providing are benefiting. So that's one indication of what the future is. There's another company that I think is a prototypical embodiment of a future orientation to value and impact, and really epitomizes the potential of the biological century, and that's Denali. When Denali was founded in 2015 to focus on CNS diseases, there was a widespread view that these diseases are intractable. They were widely dismissed by the industry and many scientists, and thought there was just not a place where it was going to be possible to have success. But Denali had a different view. Denali's view was that there was a convergence of factors that were now going to make it possible to create a product platform that could yield multiple drugs that would impact patients with CNS diseases. And so by simply asking the question, well, what if we could do it? Becoming, of course, convinced that it would be important, and then thinking very independently and clearly about, well, why might it not be possible now? Denali went on a path that at that time really nobody else was willing to go. The advances on which Denali was built are really prototypical of some of the factors driving the biological century. In particular, advances in genetic analysis, increased availability of genetic data, a variety of analytical and experimental techniques that allow you to translate identifying a genetic abnormality into understanding its functional consequences in intact systems, and also advances in protein engineering. And these advances and the work that the team at Denali is doing are making it possible to overcome what really are the two critical rate-limiting hurdles to starting to make progress with these terrible diseases. One of them is understanding the mechanisms of these diseases, and the other is overcoming this hurdle of the blood-brain barrier, which is a unique obstacle to CNS therapeutics. So the former, the progress in understanding disease, now is making it possible to implement drug development programs based on a clear understanding of the patient populations that you're trying to treat, and the use of informative biomarkers so that when you start testing your drug in these patients, you can follow what's going on and optimize how you're administering the drug and the doses that you have to get to in order to have the desired effects. This is allowing optimization of drug candidates in real time. The latter, this blood-brain barrier technology, makes it possible for the first time to consider bringing to CNS therapeutics all of these new modalities, these proteins, antisense, et cetera, that are so biologically powerful, but have sort of always been not accessible because of the blood-brain barrier. So Denali has really established itself in the last 6 years as a prototypical example of what the biological century can do. The company has 5 clinical programs underway, 3 more preclinical programs, over a dozen discovery programs. It's demonstrated very clearly that its blood-brain barrier technology enables very significant uptake of these large biological molecules into the CNS. In one study that the company has reported publicly, it's shown that in children with Hunter's disease, that it can impact across the board critical biomarkers indicating the effects of that disease. And in fact, a number of these children have had very important clinical benefits as well. Likewise, for Parkinson's disease, the company has shown markers of activity and is advancing programs for treatment of patients with Parkinson's disease. And along the way, the company has received very significant endorsements, which I think are an indication of how the world comes to these things once somebody has had the courage to step forward and show that it's possible. The company has established new precedents in raising capital, had one of the most successful IPOs in the history of biotechnology, has done multiple corporate deals, which were previously unprecedented. While the intellectual insight and the tools and the resources that I've referred to are of course, all critical pieces of this, I want to come back to the most fundamental one, which is the people who've assembled around this. Just as in Moderna, the people leading Denali and the people that work in the company represent the very best scientific minds trying to solve problems that everybody really wants solutions for. So to conclude, as improbable as they may have appeared when they were founded, companies like Moderna and Denali are vanguard companies that are actually showing the potential of the biological century. And as difficult as their paths have been, and that's inherent in biotechnology, they've had conviction that the future that they're trying to create was worth navigating those difficulties. I see Moderna and Denali as two reminders of the power of biology, fueled by a focus on possibility. Susan, gave a very moving account of her husband's illness in the previous talk, and she highlighted some of the key problems. And so, while I've pointed to some of the areas where we've had more success, what she's reminded us of, importantly, is that there's far more to do than we've yet done. Certainly, Lewy body disease, and in fact, all of the neurodegenerative diseases and the psychiatric diseases and many of the cancers and so on. And unfortunately, it's reality that it's only a matter of time before another virus emerges. So I don't mean to say that we're in any position to declare victory. We're not in any position to declare victory. We're just at the beginning. But what I will say is that despite all the challenges that we face as a society, and despite how difficult it is to create hope for people who don't have it yet, I do believe that we're in an era of great hope. Thanks very much.